Officer Jack Miller sat in his cruiser, tapping the steering wheel absent-mindedly as he gazed down the empty streets. It was a day like any other in the southern town where he'd spent most of his career, a place where he knew every corner, every alley, every shift in the wind. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. But to Miller, the change was glaringly obvious, and it irritated him deeply. More black families were moving into town, families who dressed well, drove nice cars, and moved into neighborhoods that he once considered off-limits to them. He grumbled to himself, turning his gaze to the rearview mirror. In his mind, they didn't belong. Not here. Not in his town. As he slowly cruised down the main street, he couldn't shake the feeling of resentment. His father had always told him that things were better. Back in the day. Back when people knew their place. Back when there wasn't such a push to blur the lines between races. Miller had grown up steeped in these views. As a child, he didn't question them. As an adult, he justified them as part of maintaining order. And in his role as a police officer, it was his duty to enforce that order, to keep the town the way it should be. His resentment festered, bubbling beneath the surface, quietly influencing his every decision on the job. He didn't think of it as racism, just as common sense. More diversity, more problems, he could feel it in his bones. Every time he saw a new black family moving into the neighborhood, his jaw would tighten just a little bit more. It wasn't just his personal views, he felt like the town was changing for the worse. More crime, more disrespect, more disorder. He liked the control his badge gave him. He saw it as his responsibility to remind certain people where they stood, especially when they stepped out of line. His thoughts drifted to his father's teachings. His father, a hard man, had made it clear that people like them were the backbone of society. People who worked, followed the rules, and didn't stir up trouble. The world's going soft. His father would say over dinner, shaking his head at the news. People just can't take pride in what's right anymore. Miller had absorbed those lessons like a sponge. Now they played on a loop in his mind, each day reinforcing the same old beliefs. As he drove, Miller's eyes narrowed at the sight of a sleek black sedan pulling into a parking spot outside a high-end restaurant. The driver was a well-dressed black woman, stepping out with the grace of someone who clearly knew she belonged. To Miller, it was like a challenge, a defiance of the unspoken rules that he held onto so tightly. He watched her for a moment, his grip tightening on the wheel. What was she doing here? This wasn't her place. People like her didn't belong in upscale spots like this. In his mind, it was obvious, something had to be off. She couldn't afford that car, not legitimately. Not in his town. He felt a surge of irritation bubbling up. There's no way she's here legally. He muttered to himself, his hand instinctively reaching for the switch to turn on his lights. His mind was made up before he even thought it through. The lights flashed, and the woman, still unaware of what was happening, stepped out of her car, adjusting her blazer as she prepared to walk inside. Miller got out of his cruiser, his steps heavy with authority as he approached her. "Your papers?" he demanded, his voice sharp and impatient, not bothering with any pleasantries. The woman turned to him, her expression calm, showing not a hint of worry or surprise. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and composed. She reached into her bag and pulled out her identification, handing it over without hesitation. Miller took it without even glancing at the name. "You're parked in an unauthorized area," he said, his tone accusatory, though the sign right in front of him clearly allowed parking. "And you're acting suspiciously." The woman raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor still intact. "I'm just here to pick up my order," she replied. "I didn't know that was against the law." Miller felt his blood pressure rise. There it was, that superiority, that sense of entitlement that he hated so much. She was trying to play him, trying to outsmart him, just like he'd seen so many others do before. He scowled, looking from her expensive car back to her. "I don't think you understand," he said, stepping closer, his voice laced with an unspoken threat. "You're acting suspiciously, and I want to know where you're from and why you have a car like this." The woman's calm remained unshaken. "I don't think I'm obligated to answer those questions unless I've broken the law," she said, her voice still level. Miller's jaw clenched. He was used to people falling in line when he spoke like this, used to them backing down and submitting. But not this woman. She wasn't scared. She wasn't intimidated. And that, more than anything, infuriated him. His temper flared, and without another thought he grabbed her arm roughly. "Turn around," he barked. "You're under arrest." The woman didn't resist. She let him force her toward the car, still calm, still collected. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said quietly. "But you'll find that out soon enough." Her words only fueled the fire inside him. He shoved her against the car, pulling out his handcuffs, convinced that he was doing the right thing, convinced that she was hiding something. The fact that she wasn't fighting back, wasn't arguing, only made him more certain that she was trying to outwit him, playing some kind of game. A small crowd had started to form, people murmuring as they pulled out their phones to record the scene unfolding in front of them. Some recognized the woman and whispered among themselves, but no one dared to step forward. They knew Officer Miller's reputation, and they weren't willing to risk becoming part of the situation. "Leave her alone," someone called from the back of the crowd, but Miller ignored them. His focus was entirely on the woman, on proving to her, and to the crowd, that he was in control. He could feel his frustration building with each passing second. Why wasn't she scared? Why wasn't she begging for him to stop? In his mind, her calmness was a direct challenge to his authority, and he wasn't about to let her win. "You think you'll get away with this, huh?" he hissed as he pressed her harder against the car. "You think just because you've got a nice car and a fancy suit, you're better than everyone else?" The woman didn't respond to his taunts. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken, and it only made him angrier. He finished cuffing her, pulling her upright, ready to drag her back to his cruiser. "You'll see soon enough," she said again, her voice steady as ever. "This is a mistake you won't forget." But to Miller those words were empty. He was certain he was in the right, certain that this woman thought she could walk all over him. Not today, he thought. Today, he'd show her who was really in control. The crowd was growing, and the whispers were becoming louder. People were recording, their phones pointed at him, but none of that mattered to Miller. All that mattered was proving to this woman that she wasn't above the law, not in his town, not on his watch. Officer Miller's irritation grew with each passing second. The woman remained calm, unbothered by his increasing aggression, and it gnawed at him. She didn't seem intimidated, didn't flinch under his authority, and that only fueled his frustration. She had explained herself, said she was picking up an order from the restaurant, but Miller wasn't interested in explanations. To him, her calm demeanor was just another sign of guilt, another reason to push harder. He couldn't stand the way she seemed so composed, so sure of herself, as though nothing he said or did could touch her. Acting suspiciously, he muttered under his breath, doubling down on the accusation. It wasn't about her actions anymore. It was about proving a point, about showing her, and the growing crowd, that he was in control. He wasn't going to let her make a fool out of him. He wasn't going to let her walk away as though she hadn't done anything wrong. The woman didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She maintained the same calm composure that had irritated him from the start. "I'm just picking up my order, officer," she repeated, her voice steady, respectful. But to Miller, it was condescending. He interpreted her words as an affront to his authority. His temper flared. "That's not the point," he snapped, stepping closer to her. "You're acting suspiciously, and I'm not going to let you off the hook just because you think you can outsmart me." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. Her silence only made him angrier. In his mind, she wasn't just disobeying him, she was challenging him. She was standing there, daring him to act. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands itching to take control of the situation, to show her exactly who held the power. He wasn't used to this kind of defiance, and it pushed him over the edge. Without warning, Miller grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the car. The woman didn't resist, but her calm voice cut through the tension. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Her words felt like a punch to his gut, but he pushed through it, shoving her against the car as he reached for his cuffs. A few gasps echoed from the small group of onlookers that had started to gather. Miller could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of their judgment, but he didn't care. This was about control, and he wasn't going to let some crowd tell him how to do his job. As he snapped the cuffs around the woman's wrists, she didn't struggle, didn't shout. She remained composed, though her voice carried a quiet warning. "This won't end the way you think it will." Miller ignored her, roughly pushing her up against the vehicle, his jaw clenched in frustration. The small crowd of bystanders had grown, and now people were murmuring amongst themselves, pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Some recognized the woman. A few exchanged nervous glances, uncertain about whether or not to intervene. Others kept their distance, not wanting to get involved in a situation that could easily turn volatile. One man in the crowd called out, "Leave her alone! She didn't do anything!" Miller shot the man a glare, but he kept his attention on the woman. He wasn't about to let some random bystander dictate how he handled the situation. He was in charge here. He was the authority. The woman's calmness only spurred him on. It felt like she was testing him, silently challenging his control. And Miller wasn't about to back down, not with everyone watching. "What did she do?" Someone else called out from the crowd, their voice louder this time. Another person joined in. "Why are you arresting her? She's done nothing wrong." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, the tension palpable as more people gathered. Phones were raised, capturing every moment, every aggressive shove, every unnecessary show of force. Some people started shouting at the officer, accusing him of racial profiling. "He's just doing this because she's black," a voice from the back shouted. Miller's face flushed with anger. His grip on the woman tightened. "Back off!" he yelled at the crowd, his voice hard, unyielding. He wasn't going to let them sway him. He was in control here. He knew what he was doing. This woman was acting suspiciously, and she needed to be put in her place. That was the way it worked. But the crowd wasn't backing down. More voices rose in protest, demanding answers. "What did she do? Why are you arresting her? This is wrong!" The chorus of voices grew, matching the swelling tension in the air. Despite the rising hostility, the woman remained calm, still composed. She didn't raise her voice to join the crowd's protests. Instead, she turned slightly toward them, addressing them in a calm, measured tone. "Please stay calm. Everything will be fine." Her words had a surprising effect. The crowd quieted just slightly, though their outrage simmered just beneath the surface. They didn't want to escalate things further, not with so many people recording, but the anger was still there, bubbling, waiting for the moment to boil over. Miller, feeling the pressure from the crowd, grew even more defensive. He shouted again, telling them to back off, but his voice lacked the same authority it had before. The woman's composure was getting to him. He could feel the eyes of the bystanders boring into him, judging him, questioning his every move. And despite his outward bravado, he could feel control slipping through his fingers. More phones were raised, more people recorded the unfolding scene. The videos were already being uploaded to social media, spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, the footage would be seen by thousands, and then by millions. And the narrative would be clear: a white officer aggressively arresting a black woman for seemingly no reason. Local reporters, alerted by the social media posts, started arriving at the scene. Their cameras clicked on, capturing the escalating tension, the mounting crowd, and the officer's increasingly defensive stance. The tension between Miller and the crowd continued to build. His frustration was boiling over, his control slipping further with each shout, each phone pointed in his direction. He wanted to prove he was right, that he wasn't out of line, but the calm, unshaken demeanor of the woman in cuffs undercut every ounce of his authority. She stood there, silent now, letting the crowd speak for her, letting their voices amplify the injustice of the moment. And as the bystanders grew louder, their outrage growing, Miller couldn't shake the feeling that this was quickly spiraling out of his control. The situation was becoming bigger than him, bigger than the woman he had arrested. It was turning into something far beyond his reach. The woman's calm had been a signal from the start, though Miller hadn't recognized it. Now, with the crowd rallying around her and the cameras rolling, it was clear that this arrest wasn't going to play out like all the others. As the situation continued to escalate, the flashing lights of another police car appeared at the edge of the crowd. Captain Adams, a veteran officer with decades of experience, stepped out. He had been alerted to the growing commotion by the stream of social media posts, and the urgency in the voice of dispatch. From the moment he saw the gathering crowd and heard the murmur of voices, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. He pushed through the throng of onlookers, his eyes immediately locking onto the woman standing in handcuffs, pressed against the side of her car. His stomach dropped. He recognized her instantly, Judge Evelyn Carter. A woman of stature, dignity, and immense respect in the legal community. What was she doing here, handcuffed like a common criminal? And why on earth hadn't Miller realized who she was? Adams approached quickly, his face stern as he assessed the scene. Miller, standing rigid beside the handcuffed woman, was barking orders at the crowd, trying to assert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. The crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. Their focus was on the woman, on the growing injustice they were witnessing unfold before their very eyes. "What's going on here, Officer Miller?" Adams demanded, his tone firm but calm, masking the rising dread he felt. Miller turned, momentarily startled by the presence of his captain, but quickly recovering his posture. "She was acting suspiciously, Captain," he said defensively, gesturing toward the woman as if her very existence was proof of his judgment. "She refused to cooperate, and I had to place her under arrest." Adams' eyes narrowed. He looked back at the woman in handcuffs. Judge Carter. His mind raced as he pieced together the disaster that was unfolding before him. But Miller, oblivious to the storm gathering above him, continued. "She didn't answer my questions, acted like she was above the law. I had no choice." The captain took a deep breath, his patience thinning. "Miller," he said slowly, stepping toward the woman, "do you know who this is?" The officer blinked, confusion briefly crossing his face before it was replaced with the same misplaced confidence that had driven him from the start. "No, Captain. Just another." Adams cut him off, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though the weight of his words hit like a hammer. "This is Judge Evelyn Carter. She's a federal judge." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire world had stopped. The crowd, the cameras, the angry voices, all fell away as the realization dawned on Miller. His face drained of color, his hands, still gripping the cuffs, trembled as the magnitude of his mistake sank in. This wasn't just a woman picking up an order. This wasn't just another confrontation on the street. This was a federal judge, one of the most powerful legal authorities in the state, and he had arrested her based on nothing more than his own prejudice and arrogance. Adams wasted no time. He stepped toward Judge Carter, his expression one of deep regret as he unlocked the cuffs and gently removed them from her wrists. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." His words were careful, measured, though even he knew an apology wouldn't be enough to undo what had just happened. Judge Carter stood tall, her composure unshaken despite the humiliation she had endured. She didn't rub her wrists where the cuffs had been, didn't flinch or falter. Instead, she fixed her gaze on Miller, her eyes filled with the weight of the injustice she had suffered. "You've made a grave mistake, officer," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that cut through the air like a blade. "A mistake that will not go unnoticed." Miller's legs felt weak. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? His mind raced, scrambling for excuses, for justifications, for any way to defend himself. But there was nothing. Nothing that could explain away the choice he had made, the assumptions he had clung to, the authority he had abused. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating, crushing. His career, his future, everything was slipping away from him in an instant. Captain Adams, sensing the gravity of the situation, pulled Miller aside. His face was grim, his voice low but laced with authority. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his eyes burning into Miller's. "This isn't just about you, officer. This is about the entire department. Your actions, your recklessness, have put us all in jeopardy." Miller couldn't speak. His mind was a blur, replaying every moment, every decision that had led to this disaster. How had he missed it? How had he allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment so completely? His hands trembled, and for the first time, the reality of his situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just going to lose his job. This was bigger than that. There could be legal consequences. He could be sued. His name, once respected in the department, would be dragged through the mud. Adams continued, his tone heavy with finality. There will be consequences for this, Miller. Serious consequences. This isn't just going to go away. Meanwhile, the crowd stood in stunned silence, watching as the scene unfolded before them. Their outrage had shifted from disbelief to fury, and now, with the revelation of who the woman was, the mood had darkened. Phones were still raised, cameras still rolling, capturing every moment, every glance exchanged between the officers and Judge Carter. But the narrative had changed. What had started as an arrest had now become something much bigger, a scandal, a public reckoning. Within hours, the videos had gone viral, flooding social media platforms, being shared and retweeted across the country. News outlets picked up the story, headlines plastered with phrases like, "Racist arrest of federal judge sparks outrage," and asterisk, "Systemic racism in policing exposed in shocking incident." Asterisk, the footage of Miller roughly arresting Judge Carter was played over and over, analyzed and dissected by news anchors, commentators, and activists alike. Protests began to form outside the police station. People from all corners of the community gathered, demanding justice for Judge Carter and accountability for the police department. Signs reading, "End racial profiling," and "Justice for Judge Carter," filled the streets, and chants for reform echoed throughout the town. The department, once a quiet and respected institution, found itself at the center of a storm. Calls for Officer Miller's immediate removal flooded the phone lines. Human rights organizations weighed in, calling for systemic changes in the way the department handled cases of racial bias. Inside the police station, the fallout was just as intense. Captain Adams held emergency meetings with the department's leadership, discussing how they would handle the public relations disaster that had just exploded in their faces. They couldn't sweep this under the rug. Too many eyes were watching now. Too much damage had already been done. Miller sat alone in a small, windowless room, waiting for the inevitable. He knew there was no way out of this. His actions had brought the department to the brink of collapse. He had acted on his worst instincts, and now he would have to face the consequences. As the protests raged outside and the media continued to scrutinize every detail of the incident, Judge Evelyn Carter stood as a symbol of resilience and justice. Her calm in the face of such blatant discrimination had only amplified her voice in the national conversation about racial inequality. And though the arrest had been unjust, the power of her position and the strength of her character ensured that her story would not end here. The consequences of Officer Miller's actions were far-reaching, but they had ignited a much-needed conversation about the deep-seated biases that still permeated law enforcement. This moment, though painful, was the beginning of a reckoning. Officer Miller's suspension was swift and decisive. The moment the full weight of his actions became public, the department had no choice but to act. With the video of the arrest spreading like wildfire, and outrage growing by the minute, Miller was placed on immediate leave pending an internal investigation. His badge and gun were taken, and he was told to await further instruction. The message was clear: his career, at least for now, was hanging by a thread. The police department, now under intense scrutiny, issued a public statement within hours of the incident going viral. They acknowledged the wrong that had been done, admitting that the arrest of Judge Carter was unjust and promising to take corrective measures. The tone of the statement was one of damage control, an attempt to calm the rising tide of public anger. But it wasn't enough. The community, and increasingly the nation, demanded more than just an apology. Meanwhile, Judge Carter's silence had ended. Standing at a podium before a sea of reporters, she delivered a press conference that would set the tone for the days to come. With poise and unwavering determination, she spoke not just about her personal experience, but about the broader issue of racial discrimination in law enforcement. "This was not just an attack on me as a person," she said, her voice firm but calm. "It was an attack on the principles of fairness and justice that this country is supposed to uphold." Her words were powerful. She didn't dwell on the personal indignity she had suffered, but instead used the moment to shine a light on the systemic issues that led to the incident in the first place. "This is not an isolated event," she continued. "It is part of a much larger pattern, a pattern of bias, of racial profiling, of an inherent lack of accountability within certain parts of our justice system. And that must change." The press conference was broadcast across the nation, and her message resonated far beyond the small southern town where it had all begun. Her calm composure, even in the face of such an egregious injustice, became a symbol of the fight against systemic racism. What had started as an unjust arrest had now evolved into something much bigger, an opportunity to confront the deep-seated biases that plagued law enforcement not just locally, but across the country. Judge Carter's impact didn't stop there. Days after her press conference, she was invited to speak at a local rally. Thousands gathered, holding signs calling for justice, for change, for an end to the kind of prejudice that had led to her wrongful arrest. As she took the stage, the crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. "We must not let this moment pass without action," she declared, her voice rising with passion. "Too many times we have seen incidents like this, and too many times they have been swept under the rug. We cannot allow that to happen again. We must stand together, demand better, and push for the reforms that are so desperately needed." Her speech ignited a wave of energy in the crowd. It wasn't just about outrage anymore. It was about hope. Hope that change could come if enough people stood up and fought for it. Her words rippled across the nation, sparking conversations in communities far beyond the town's borders. People were talking about racial justice in new ways, calling for reforms, questioning the practices of their local police departments. Under mounting pressure from both the public and human rights groups, the police department had no choice but to implement real changes. The community's anger and the media's unrelenting coverage left them no room to maneuver. They had to act, and they had to act fast. The first step was instituting mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, not just as a one-time measure, but as a continual part of their professional development. But training alone wouldn't be enough. There had to be structural changes. Policies were revised to ensure greater accountability, especially in cases of potential racial profiling. Officers were now required to wear body cameras during all interactions with the public, ensuring that there would be a clear record of any and all future incidents. These measures were aimed at restoring some of the trust that had been shattered by Miller's actions. Perhaps most importantly, the department began implementing community engagement programs, designed to foster better relationships between the police and the town's marginalized communities. Officers were encouraged to attend town meetings, interact with local leaders, and get to know the people they served on a deeper level. It was an attempt to bridge the gap that had long existed between the police and the citizens they were supposed to protect. Slowly, the tension that had permeated the town began to ease. Still, the scars of what had happened were far from healed. For many, trust in the system had been irrevocably damaged. But for others, the changes represented a glimmer of hope, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, things could be different moving forward. As the days turned into weeks, the protests gradually quieted, but the movement Judge Carter had ignited showed no signs of slowing. Her courage had sparked something larger than any one incident. She became a national figure, a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon for those fighting for equality and justice. Her name became synonymous with the fight against systemic racism, and her presence was felt in courtrooms, town halls, and rallies across the country. In the end, the story of her arrest was not just about a single moment of injustice. It was about what followed: the demand for accountability, the push for reforms, the refusal to accept the status quo. It was about how one person's courage could force an entire system to confront its own failings. Judge Carter's dignity and determination inspired others to take up the cause, to speak out, to demand more from their leaders, their institutions, and themselves. The changes that followed were just the beginning. But they represented a step in the right direction, a step toward a future where no one would have to face what she had faced simply because of the color of their skin. In the end, the story of Judge Carter wasn't just a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice. It was a story about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the belief that real change is possible. It was a reminder that, no matter how entrenched the system might seem, it can be challenged, it can be changed, and it can be made to serve the people, all people, with justice and fairness. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more obstacles to overcome. But the movement for change had begun, and as long as